On May 13, 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico. President James Polk claimed that America had been attacked. But in reality, the invasion was a brazen land grab. American troops made it all the way to Mexico City, and the U.S. annexed much of today's western United States. The future founder of the Republican Party, an Illinois congressman named Abraham Lincoln, passionately opposed the war. But today's Republicans have Mexico in their sights once again. Back when he was president, Donald Trump asked Defense Secretary Mark Esper if he could launch missiles at Mexico's drug cartels without Mexico's permission, and then blame the attack on another country. We could do it quietly, Trump said. No one would know it was us. Esper told him the idea was ridiculous. An act of war against one of America's biggest trading partners. But Trump would not back down, and an Oval Office fantasy
I will deploy all necessary military assets
became a 2024 campaign pledge.
Justified military force to decimate the cartel.
You tell the Mexican president, either you do it or we do it.
And soon it was a popular Republican policy. Over 20 Republican congressmen have signed on to a vast war power authorization.
On my orders.
Like the measures for Iraq and Afghanistan. Trump has ordered his advisors to draw up battle plans, calling for missile strikes, a naval blockade, and boots on the ground. How did America and Mexico come to this?
Welcome to a special hour on Mexico. I'm Fareed Zakaria. From the border to the economy to the cartels, America and Mexico have a relationship that has been crucial and complicated. America blames Mexico for its deadly drug crisis, while American demand helps keep the cartels in business. Millions pour over the southern border, but without Mexico's help, there would likely be millions and millions more. In a myriad of ways, this pivotal relationship and how America chooses to shape it holds the keys to both countries' future.
Fentanyl is now driving the drug overdose crisis across the country.
It is the most lethal drug epidemic in American history. The fentanyl crisis. Synthetic opioids, mostly fentanyl, killed an estimated 75,000 Americans in 2023 alone. More than all of the U.S. troops killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam combined. Deaths went up 94% in a 3-year period. And no one brings more fentanyl into the United States than the Sinaloa drug cartel in Mexico. It was headed for years famously by Joaquin Guzman, better known by his nickname, El Chapo. No one put more drugs on the street in American history than him.
The DEA says Guzman was responsible for 25% of all the narcotics flowing into the U.S.
El Chapo built a sophisticated billion-dollar multinational empire that rivaled Fortune 500 companies.
He was apprehended a few times and got away a couple of times, but now is in the U.S. criminal system and doesn't look to get out anytime soon.
El Chapo bequeathed his vast empire to 4 of his sons,
The Sinaloa cartel unleashed a heavily armed fighting force.
known as the Little Chapos or Los Chapitos.
Ivan, Alfredo, Ovidio, and Joaquin.
And it was El Chapo's sons who made a prescient early bet on a promising new product and would become America's biggest suppliers of fentanyl.
They were able to see that producing fentanyl will be the new, very important synthetic drug in the market.
Americans had been hooked on prescription opioids like OxyContin in the 90s.
Doctors are prescribing more and more Percocet, Vicodin, OxyContin, and we can't seem to stop taking it.
But then the government cracked down on Big Pharma in the 2000s. The crackdown left a massive void in the opioid market, and Los Chapitos raced to fill it. First with heroin, then with fentanyl. The profits from their new product were off the charts.
The bosses of the Sinaloa cartel are able to get, just for themselves, $400 million per month, just profits in the pocket.
Just 5 pounds of fentanyl could be sold for 10 times as much money as 7,000 pounds of methamphetamine. What's more, fentanyl was easier to make than other drugs, in small labs, in kitchens and basements. Instead of massive operations out in the jungle, as with cocaine.
It's very easy and very cheap. You don't need all that infrastructure.
By 2017, fentanyl was causing more overdoses than any other drug in America. Meanwhile, in Mexico, a new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, was embracing a new approach to the drug war.
He's even popularized a saying, abrazos no balazos.
Hugs, not bullets. After years of Mexico's military fighting the cartels, Mexico's people had paid a horrifying price. Tens of thousands were dead from drug-related violence. AMLO wanted to reduce that violence and boost the job market. He dismantled much of Mexico's years-long security collaboration with America.
This is what it sounds like when a drug cartel overpowers the state.
But when Mexican forces tried to capture one of Los Chapitos,
they're outgunning law enforcement.
It doesn't even look like it was close to being a fair fight.
They were no match for the cartel's army.
The Mexican military captured them and then they got away.
Los Chapitos are powerful and strong, but not by themselves. They have the complicity of many parts of the Mexican government.
And the Little Chapo's lethal product kept on coming. By 2021, American overdose deaths, mostly from fentanyl, were over 7 times higher than in 2015.
With all of the carnage from the fentanyl epidemic, bombing the cartels without Mexico's permission may be a tempting election-year talking point. But experts on the drug trade agree that this would only be a fool's errand and make things even worse for both Mexico and America.
The challenge with the idea of bombing cartels is, what are you going to bomb?
Fentanyl labs are so small and so plentiful that trying to bomb them would be like bombing every convenience store in New York City.
You have to kill all the civilians that live in Culiacan.
the United States would be at war with its biggest trading partner. And migration, already setting records, would spike even more.
It's ridiculous that you are thinking that, let's bump to the cartels.
If America really wants to hit the cartels where it hurts, it should tackle its own insatiable demand for their product. Roughly 80% of the world's opioids are consumed in the United States of America.
Do you really want to fight against the cartels? Destroy the market.
But rather than attacking the demand problem,
DEA, please, open the door!
America has relied on brute force to fight drug cartels.
The DEA says it has trained 551 Mexican police officers
In a decades-long losing game of whack-a-mole.
70% of all the cocaine seized in the United States came from here.
In the 1980s, Miami was America's capital of cocaine.
The largest bust in United States history.
$1 billion worth of cocaine.
The DEA launched Operation Swordfish, indicting dozens in the drug trade. But the cocaine kept on coming.
Operation Just Cause. U.S. troops fanned out in the air and on the ground.
In 1989,
the goals of the United States have been to combat drug trafficking.
President George H.W. Bush invaded Panama.
I got you covered.
To take out its leader, drug trafficker Manuel Noriega.
Well, I think it's a major victory against the drug lords.
But American demand was still going through the roof. In the late 1990s,
we are proud to stand with our friend and our neighbor.
President Bill Clinton launched Plan Colombia.
This is a war, and the enemy is cocaine.
Sending billions to that country's military to target its cocaine operations. Drug production did slow down, but then came back even bigger. And the production decline in Colombia led to Mexico's cartels filling the vacuum.
We've seen this over and over again. If you destroy one laboratory, you destroy one field, you destroy one network, others will come and replace that.
And there's another way that America actually helps Mexico's cartels, besides its appetite for their product. 70 to 90% of all the guns trafficked in Mexico come from the United States.
It is a case that the Mexican government has long claimed against the United States. You want us to stop sending drugs, well, you need to stop sending the guns that fuel the violence here.
Coming up, the southern border, and how the U.S. has relied on Mexico to be its border enforcer.
Major surge of border crossings.
Over 2.4 million migrants were apprehended last year, an all-time high.
Those numbers have been staggering.
Breaking the record set just 1 year earlier, which topped the record set the year before that.
We are at the point of no return.
People have been coming
everywhere from Haiti to Venezuela.
From all over the world.
India, Vietnam, Afghanistan.
But one country that's actually not driving the surge is Mexico. At the start of the century, Mexicans made up 98% of the migrants at the southern border. Last year, only 29% were from Mexico. What's more, the number of Mexicans coming to America has sometimes been fewer than the number of Mexicans leaving the U.S. to go back to Mexico in recent years. That's due in part to the country's economy, which has been doing pretty well.
People want to stay home. And the more working opportunities there are in Mexico, the more people will tend to stay home or even return.
Mexico has even become a destination for many migrants, the 5th most popular country for asylum seekers in the world in 2022. Instead of being big border crossers, the Mexicans have become America's go-to border enforcers.
Sadly, one element of an American response is always going to be to outsource as much of the enforcement question as it can to the Mexican government.
Mexico is actually in very much the same bind with migration as America.
Mexico has a very similar problem. Overwhelmed with people who are applying for asylum. Police forces are overwhelmed. The shelters are totally overwhelmed.
And as Mexico's government struggles to keep up, the journey has become even more perilous for the migrants.
What makes it so dangerous is the fact that there are threats really on all sides.
On the one side, violent drug cartels who have found a cruel new way to make money.
You see organized crime moving increasingly into the trafficking of migrants.
The smuggling business has become even more lucrative than dealing fentanyl. For migrants, it can be just as deadly.
When cartels can't extort migrants for money, they often just kill the people they've kidnapped.
Another danger, often Mexican authorities, sometimes corrupt, sometimes inept, sometimes lethal. In March 2023, a fire broke out at a migrant detention center.
Migrants were left locked in the cells,
killing dozens. Looming over all of this mess is the United States.
There's no question that the U.S. is certainly complicit in some of the things that are happening in Mexico, if not outright responsible.
The fact is, America has relied on Mexico to do its dirty work for years, deterring, detaining, and deporting migrants before they get to America's southern border. And it's a strategy that's been relied upon by both Republicans and Democrats.
July 2014, America was witnessing an unprecedented crisis.
They came without their parents.
A wave of migrant children coming from Central America.
Seemingly overnight, tens of thousands of children and families showed up at the southern border. The U.S. government was caught completely flat-footed.
President Obama pushed Mexico to focus on the southern border, Mexico's southern border. 1,000 miles away, U.S. dollars helped transform Mexico's border with Guatemala. A network of military bases, observation towers, canine teams, and mobile checkpoints sprung up on the hunt for migrants.
In part because of strong efforts by Mexico, we've seen those numbers reduced back to much more manageable levels.
The next year, Mexico deported more Central Americans than the United States for the first time in history.
And so by the end of the Obama administration, you weren't seeing the same kind of drama at the southern border that you saw in 2014. People kind of wrote it off as problem solved.
But Obama's strategy didn't work for long. President Trump arrived with bold rhetoric.
We're not letting these people invade our country.
But when his draconian policies failed,
the growing outrage over families being separated at the border,
and the construction of his border wall dragged, Trump focused on turning Mexico into his wall. Many believed that would be a challenge. Mexico's new leader, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, had campaigned on ending his country's migrant crackdown.
This idea that we're not going to do America's dirty work.
Viva Mexico!
But as a fresh wave of migrants headed for the U.S.,
we want all of them to stop. We want Mexico to stop.
Trump threatened to bury Mexico's economy under an avalanche of tariffs. AMLO changed his tune on migration.
Once he came into office, he doubled down and moved even further than the previous government.
He expanded Trump's Remain in Mexico policy
forced to wait in some of the most dangerous cities on Earth.
Trapping more migrants in Mexico. And he turned his newly formed National Guard, meant for taking on drug violence, into a border patrol. Thousands of troops fanned out across Mexico.
And there were scenes, really grisly scenes, all through Mexico, of these National Guardsmen really cracking down and responding with force.
Migrants were tear gassed, beaten, and thrown into prison-like detention centers. Some were shot and killed. The Mexican government has defended the National Guard, saying it respects human rights.
Mexico is doing more for the United States as of now than Congress.
President Biden took office promising to dramatically change the nation's approach to migration.
It's time for our better angels to prevail.
But the U.S. continued to rely on Mexico to do its dirty work.
Cooperation on migration continued and even expanded with the Biden administration.
The results under Biden? More of the same.
Let's get real. In the same way that water runs downhill, human beings go where there's a better deal.
And that better deal, more economic opportunity and a better life, continues to be found in the United States. The truth is, Mexico can't solve America's border crisis. It's really up to America.
All of the obvious solutions to reduce pressure at the southern border run through Congress. And Congress is a kind of dead zone on this issue.
Lawmakers block a border deal.
And so we run right into a wall.
And in a surprising twist, that political paralysis has given Mexico leverage over Washington. With America depending on Mexico to control the border, AMLO used that leverage to strengthen his hand at home, inching Mexico toward autocracy without a peep from the U.S. Coming up next, the disturbing rise of an illiberal democracy next door. Mass protests against alleged election fraud. Demands for a recount.
Stop the steal! Stop the steal!
A politician insisting he won the presidency weeks after officials called the election for his opponent.
This was a landslide.
A familiar story for American voters. And as it turns out, for Mexican voters too.
Vamos a pedir que se limpien las elecciones.
After 2 months of public debate, accusations, and protests in the streets, a winner has finally been declared in Mexico's presidential election.
The year was 2006, and the election's loser, the man sowing the chaos, was the former Mexico City mayor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. AMLO, as he's come to be known, would never forget that loss. And for that, Mexico's democracy would suffer. In 2018, AMLO won the presidency and increasingly adopted Donald Trump's ways. Accused of defying the Constitution and threatening Mexico's democracy. His hand-picked successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, was recently elected president. And many fear that AMLO will still be the power behind the throne once she takes office.
In his head, he's not the president of Mexico. He's the owner of Mexico.
Mexico is rapidly becoming an illiberal democracy, like Hungary or Turkey, but in this case, right on America's doorstep.
The birth of Mexico's modern democracy is an inspiring and relatively recent tale. The country was a one-party state for over 7 decades, ruled by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI.
They held elections, but not free and fair elections. So they managed to control the presidency, the federal government, as well as the governorships and others for many, many years.
Every leader chose his successor, and the party was accused of relying on repression and fraud to ensure victory. But then along came a small but mighty government watchdog, the Federal Electoral Institute. It oversaw Mexico's elections and became the foundation of Mexico's democracy.
This Electoral Institute really became world-class. It became one of the most independent, run by technically sophisticated people, and became known as a model of electoral agencies.
In 2000, the PRI's grip on power finally ended, with then-President Ernesto Zedillo paving the way for Mexico's first free and fair election. But AMLO was just around the corner. After he lost the presidency for the first time in 2006,
Vamos a seguir luchando.
he ran and lost again in 2012. Through it all, he kept his eyes on the prize.
In a few hours, Mexicans will be waking up to Andrés Manuel López Obrador as their newly elected president.
Amigas, amigos.
The year was 2018. López Obrador and his Morena party were now calling the shots. And Mexico's hallowed election watchdog, the successor to the agency that called AMLO's election losses, was in their crosshairs.
AMLO was upset that he lost the 2006 election, and it was the Electoral Institute that called the result. So he has always, since that moment, held a grudge.
In an effort to undercut the Institute, AMLO has again and again championed what he calls electoral reform. In late 2022, he proposed massive cuts to the Institute's budget and personnel, potentially crippling its capacity to run elections. Democracy as Mexico knew it hung in the balance. Even so, Mexico's legislature approved AMLO's reforms. Protesters took to the streets. But then, Mexico's Supreme Court overturned the president's plan, saving Mexican democracy for now.
He systematically eroded the checks and balances that civil society leaders and politicians worked hard to build up over the last 20 years.
Taking a page out of Donald Trump's playbook, López Obrador has repeatedly vilified members of the media.
Imagínense si nada más escucha uno a Ciro.
At one press conference, he named several prominent journalists, saying that listening to them is, quote, bad for your health, and that, quote, you could even develop a brain tumor. The very next day, there was an assassination attempt against one of those journalists, prominent news anchor Ciro Gomez Leiva.
Mexico, I think, is probably one of the most dangerous countries in which to be a journalist in the world. And it doesn't seem like the government is even coming close to taking the situation seriously enough.
Another frightening feature of AMLO's Mexico? A chilling surveillance tool called Pegasus. Operators can covertly install the powerful software on a target's cell phone and then see nearly everything on that device, from texts to emails to photos.
El voto distinto. 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 El voto dis
Mexico's military was the first ever client to purchase the spyware over a decade ago. And over the years, Mexico has been one of the most prolific users of the software in the world. The company that developed Pegasus says that its software is supposed to be used only for fighting crime and terrorism.
AMLO promised to end the political spying, but Pegasus infections targeting journalists and activists have continued under his watch. Many suspect the military is responsible. They deny it. And the military's powers under AMLO hardly end there.
The military became, with AMLO, the main power in Mexico. And this is very, very, very dangerous.
AMLO and his Morena majority legislature replaced the federal police with a new National Guard full of active military members. Mexico's armed forces have also headed up customs operations and built major infrastructure projects like a controversial new airport.
To see the degree to which the military is now kind of out, to see the degree to which the military is
With AMLO's hand-picked successor, President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum, set to take office in October, that remains to be seen. Coming up, despite all of its challenges, Mexico could actually be on the cusp of an economic golden age. That's next.
Mexico faces enormous challenges like migration, the drug cartels, and corruption. But it's also a nation of great promise that could be on the cusp of a long economic boom. JP Morgan's CEO recently said that if you had to pick one country to invest in, Mexico might be the #1 opportunity. The big reason? Because in the great competition between the world's two great economic powers, the United States and China, the big winner could be Mexico. To understand why, we need to visit a city close to the Texas border, which is at the center of Mexico's hopes for a brighter future.
Monterrey, Mexico is nothing short of a boomtown these days. It resembles Southern California, with swanky shopping malls, pricey restaurants, and luxury apartments. Outside of town, new factories are sprouting up everywhere. That's because this city of 5 million, a major industrial hub in Mexico, is at the center of a massive metamorphosis in the world economy, where Mexico is challenging China as America's factory.
It's a hugely significant moment in terms of understanding what's changed about the nature of globalization that we've all grown up with.
China's factories are famous for making cheap t-shirts and jeans.
In the 1990s and 2000s, China was the factory of the world, thanks to its endless supply of cheap labor.
China-centric globalization has dominated the last 3 decades. Clothing, shoes, 50, 60, 70, sometimes 90% of products made in China.
Corporate America thrived on this China-centric business model, experiencing a golden age of profit.
It's time to get pissed off!
We want to keep our jobs.
But American manufacturing was hit hard.
They want to take your throat out. They want to cut you apart.
They're ripping us off, folks. We're going to stand up to China.
And along came Donald Trump, who punished China with tariffs. President Biden kept those tariffs.
When the world's factory shuts down, it ripples around the globe.
And the pandemic disrupted supply chains with China even more.
Dozens of cargo ships are idling at two of the biggest ports in the U.S.
Lined up, ready to go.
Running out of a vast range of manufactured goods causes a significant reassessment.
American companies wanted their suppliers to be much closer to home.
Geographical proximity to the U.S. cannot be overstated.
And a popular trend emerged.
Nearshoring. Nearshoring.
Nearshoring.
Nearshoring.
Nearshoring basically means bringing production back from a faraway place to a closer place. And they look, in part, at Mexico.
Mexico became America's ideal partner, right across the border with low-cost labor and a free trade deal. In 2023, it eclipsed China as America's leading source of foreign goods.
We see trade up 20-25%. It's in autos, it's in machinery, it's in electronics.
I mean, there's a feeling of you got to get in there fast. It's like almost a gold rush.
There have been more goods coming across the border at Laredo, Texas, than goods arriving at the Port of Los Angeles.
Trucks often wait hours for a chance to cross into Laredo.
Many of those goods come from Monterrey and its home state of Nuevo León.
Tesla is opening a gigafactory in the Monterrey area.
The state offers good security and a highly skilled workforce. Tec de Monterrey, Mexico's MIT, trains top engineers. The competition for local labor is intense, driving unemployment down to less than 3%.
The Mexican worker, they're certainly in a position where they have much greater bargaining power than in many other parts of the world.
Chinese companies are showing their robust manufacturing presence.
And in an unexpected twist, lots of Chinese companies are coming to Mexico too, to get a Made in Mexico label for their goods and avoid U.S. tariffs. Trade between China and Mexico spiked nearly 40% in 4 years.
Chinese companies are reacting aggressively.
China's bold moves in Mexico could backfire.
Our hemisphere has been invaded by China.
There's talk in the U.S. of closing their clever tariff loophole. But as America continues to distance itself from China in their geopolitical battle royale, Mexico's hopes remain sky high. And Monterrey is poised to lead a nation toward a brighter future. Coming up, I'll give you my thoughts on Mexico.
Now for some closing thoughts on this crucial relationship. One of Mexico's longest-serving presidents during the 19th century is said to have remarked about his country's fate. Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. In fact, for much of its modern history, Mexico almost defined itself in opposition to the US. As I've written before, people don't realize how far the relationship has come. Mexico saw itself as part of what was then called the Third World, resentful of its neo-colonial treatment at the hands of its arrogant neighbor to the north. From the Mexican perspective, the United States' relationship with it was characterized by exploitation and annexation. After a failed attempt to purchase what is now California, Arizona, New Mexico, and other western states, President James Polk invaded Mexico and essentially seized this territory. In 1853, the United States acquired even more Mexican land in the Gadsden Purchase. In total, the U.S. got roughly half of Mexico's land. After that, and well into the 20th century, Washington's approach toward Mexico was usually aimed at protecting the interests of large American corporations, especially its oil companies that had tried to operate in Mexico with minimal interference from local authorities. All this bred a political climate of defiance and resistance towards Washington that made cross-border cooperation difficult on almost any issue. Mexico was one of the few countries that rejected U.S. assistance through John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress program. Things turned in the 1990s. The Cold War ended, and the idea of a socialist country became less threatening to the United States. Mexico went through a series of economic crises in the 80s and 90s and desperately needed help. It began opening up its economy and its political system. U.S. firms were doing more business in Mexico and wanted a stable trading partner. Washington began to realize that the best solution to all the problems across the border, immigration, drugs, violence, was a prosperous, democratic Mexico. Relations between Mexico and the U.S. soon transformed. The old anti-Americanism faded into oblivion. The two countries stepped up cooperation on almost all relevant issues, signing the North American Free Trade Agreement and working together on everything from water management to immigration to drugs. The U.S. used to be inundated with Mexicans coming illegally into the country. Over the past decade and a half, more Mexicans have actually gone back home than have arrived. But with the rise of AMLO's party, now deeply entrenched with a near supermajority under its new leader, Claudia Sheinbaum, the reformers are in retreat. Don't expect to see much pressure coming from the north. Under Trump and Biden, Washington has had a transactional relationship with Mexico. Help us with drugs and immigration, and mostly with immigration, and we will not press you on the backsliding of democracy and the rule of law in Mexico. The result has been that Mexico is transforming into an illiberal democracy with a new one-party state that is turning its back on many of the reforms that have modernized its economy and society over the last 4 decades. This is tragic. Mexico is the United States' top trading partner, even outranking China and Canada. But this understates the interdependence between the two economies. One study estimated that 30% of finished goods the United States imports from Mexico is US-made content, higher than any other country. A staggering number of people go back and forth across the border every day just to work, shop, or see a doctor. By one estimate, over 140 million times a year. The two peoples are now deeply intertwined, economically, politically, and culturally. The late George Shultz, Ronald Reagan's rock-ribbed Republican Secretary of State, used to tell me that he thought the greatest opportunity facing the United States was to take its relations with Canada and Mexico and transform them, turning the region into a North American powerhouse. It would become, he believed, the greatest economic engine in the world and create a zone of peace, prosperity, and cooperation, an even more powerful model than the European Union. Today, we see on both sides of the border narrow self-interest and short-term politics. But Shultz's long-term vision should be the strategic goal for both nations. Thank you for watching this special hour on Mexico. I'm Fareed Zakaria.